Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Stewart,
Here.
Councilmember Kovar,
Here.
Councilmember DeBala,
Here.
Councilmember Costick.
I'm here. I'll be on video in a minute.
Oh, excellent.
Mhm.
So Councilmember Costick is here. Councilmember Siemens,
Present.
Councilmember Smith,
Here.
Councilmember Searcy.
Thank you
Everyone's
very
here.
much. This evening, we're going to begin our meeting with a moment of silence in memory of Beatriz Cordero Acia. Miss Beebe was a long-term resident of Tacoma Park, and she unfortunately recently lost her fight with COVID-19. She was a business owner. She owned and ran Infant Garden Bilingual Daycare since 2010, and she was a resident of Ward 6. And so we'd like to take this moment now and remember Miss Beebe. Thank you, everyone. And we extend our sympathies and support to Miss Beebe's family. And thank you. So looking at our agenda for this evening, we have no changes. Looking at our upcoming agenda, next week, the City Council will not have a scheduled meeting. We will meet again on June 3rd. We will start the evening actually at 6 p.m. that night with a closed session regarding personnel and collective bargaining negotiations. So that will begin at 6 p.m. We will have our public meeting begin at 7:30. That evening, we have two proclamations, one regarding Gun Violence Awareness Day. I remind all my colleagues to wear orange that day on June 3rd. It is also Immigrant Heritage Month. Our voting session on June 3rd will include the second reading ordinance regarding traffic calming on the 7300 and the 7600 blocks of Wildwood Drive. We have two work sessions scheduled for June 3rd. One is a discussion of committee appointment process, and the other is a discussion of the emergency ordinance that we put in place in March, giving the city manager emergency authority. Our next meeting then will be on June 10th at 7:30. At that time, we tentatively have scheduled a recognition of our Youth Council graduating seniors, and we will also have a proclamation for Chesapeake Bay Awareness Week. Our voting session tentatively will be a resolution regarding committee appointments. Our work session on the 10th will include an update on election planning and selection of election services vendor, and an update on COVID-19 assistance to residents and businesses. Then our next meeting will be on June 17th at 7:30. Our voting session tentatively is an ordinance authorizing a contract for election services. Our work sessions include a discussion of options for fringe benefits for future councils, and that will be with our Human Resource Director. And we have tentatively scheduled a tree canopy goal work session and tree ordinance amendment work session on June 17th. And then on Wednesday, June 24th at 7:30, we have a voting session tentatively scheduled is a adoption of tree canopy goals and the first reading ordinance amending the tree ordinance. And our work session on the night of the 24th will be a recap of the 2020 legislative session and discussion of legislative priorities. So that is our upcoming June schedule. All right, going back to our meeting this evening. We will now take public comments on voting items tonight. Tonight, we have our single reading ordinance adopting our FY 2021 tax rates, our second reading ordinance adopting our stormwater management budget, and our second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2021 budget. And we have first reading ordinance for traffic calming on Wildwood Drive, the 7300 block and the 7600 block. This evening, we've had 2 people sign up to speak on the budget, and I will take those first. I see Mr. Eubner is all set to go. Mr. Eubner, we can unmute him. He's ready to go.
First of all, thanks to Jesse for putting up with all this and getting us through it. And I want to address the council. Good evening. My name is Paul Hubner. I live on Carroll Avenue in Ward 3. I asked that the council table the motion to approve the FY21 budget, even as reconciled, for at least one more week. Take the time during this once in a century health crisis and economic collapse and do a deeper dive into budgeted expenses. Do not fall into the trap of business as usual by rushing through this vote based on the calendar. This crisis is here now, and you have a responsibility to properly plan to deal with it now and through the next fiscal year. In addition to county, state, and national analyses, even the chair of the Federal Reserve stated that we will not return to where we were for at least a year to a year and a half, with 67% of elderly affected and GDP declining some 40+%. For this year alone, the current reconciliations cut about $1.2 million from the proposed budget. Last year's reconciliation totaled $1.228 million. No real difference. A deeper dive would serve residents, businesses, and even staff better. For example, the current FY21 proposed budget has $344,277 in conferences, training, and dues, and an additional $62,000 in overtime training for police. Surely cuts can be made in one of these, but the council only proposes some $61,000 in cuts. Window dressing. Hazardous pay at $5 an hour is $10,000 per year per person, plus benefits, matchings, and bonuses, which are other line items. So I say cut all conferences, training, and dues for this budget year to help balance for any hazard pay at once. It is also instructed to review the German employment model of the Great Recession to cut all employee hours from 40 hours per week to 30 hours per week in order to afford keeping staff positions before considering cuts. And please reflect on the great factual analysis submitted last week by a budget study group of residents. Finally, I again urge you to table this motion. Take a deeper dive and don't be fooled again. The emergency is in the community, not in the proposed deadlines of City Hall. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Miss Julie Body. Is she with us? You guys saw her?
Here I am.
Hey,
Can you-
Julie. You
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead and start.
Okay. Thank you. Tacoma Park, informally called Azalea City, is a Tree City, USA, and a nuclear-free zone. That's how the city describes itself on its webpage. And the description as a nuclear-free zone is also a prominent part of Wikipedia's description of the city. Our reputation as a nuclear-free zone is popular. Over the years, I've run into it in my travels a lot. You're from Tacoma Park? Oh, that's a nuclear-free city, isn't it? The mayor has made that reputation international recently by signing the international ban on nuclear weapons. And yet this reputation is more aspirational than factual, certainly financially speaking. Through our taxes, we have been paying heavily for banking services from a notoriously nuclear weapons investing bank and engaging in direct investments in nuclear weapons subsidizing entities, though the city code prohibits it. Over the past 5 years or so, the Nuclear Free Committee has repeatedly advised the council of the irregularities of this situation. In the past, city staff have responded by informing us that the staff or council are too busy. And once when we pressed them, they replied there were discrepancies in our suggestion. To clarify and to lighten the work of the city manager, Nuclear Free Committee members Kitty Tucker and her husband Robert Alvarez researched city expenditures on nuclear weapons entities and presented their findings at a council meeting. Hundreds of people have signed a petition endorsing these efforts since then, as the council has responded by including this issue in its Green Party statement. Why not put our money where our mouth is and extend resolve in the relevance of this issue to these budget meetings, namely that city financing currently invested in nuclear weapons production directly or indirectly shift to community and environmentally friendly ones, thereby freeing the city from financial entanglements which corrupt its code and instead embracing more fully the well-being of its residents. Why not make it a budget priority to begin the process? Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, those were all the public comments we have this evening. We will now move on to our voting session. Our first item, is our tax rate, and then we'll move into being the stormwater management budget, and then our overall budget. Before we get into that, I'd like to turn it over to our city manager.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to take a few minutes and speak to my thanks to my staff. Late last November, I was informed by Deputy City Manager Jason Damweber that he and his family would be moving to Colorado. I knew then that the preparation of the FY21 budget would be difficult. With a vacant Deputy City Manager position, a vacant budget specialist position, a brand new HR director, and several other key vacant positions, the work involved to prepare a budget would be very hard. But we persevered. Finance Director Susan Chung set up the financial software so that numbers could be entered, provided instructions to staff. While working on the background budget prep, we advertised to fill the vacant positions. We began union negotiations with our 2 unions. We were also heavily involved in obtaining assistance for our small businesses affected by Purple Line construction. We were working with council on the climate change resolution. We were going after grant money for major projects. And we were planning for community engagement related to the recreation center. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit. In little more than 24 hours, we moved to working remotely. Within a week of the governor's emergency stay-at-home orders, I needed to make final decisions on the numbers to include in the proposed budget. I did not have the time I normally have to confer again with council members and to order second rounds of cuts. The same high-level managers that were now trying to rescue small businesses, help family and apartments, oversee staff in essential positions or working remotely, also were tasked with writing the budget narrative for their sections of the proposed budget document. This work was often done late at night between emergencies. Then staff who had never worked on assembling the budget document before jumped in and pulled it together. Intern Charlotte Mann designed the cover. Communications specialist Donna Wright pulled the document together. She had worked on it for one previous year. Donna's work was done during a 3-week period when she had no days off, when communicating about the health emergency was the critical priority. Remarkably, the FY21 proposed budget document had almost no typos and looked professional. I was able to present my proposed budget on schedule on April 6th. And April 6th was also new Deputy City Manager Jessica Clark's first day. Now the work of the council began. I knew that the council was in for more work than usual because the economic environment was so different than 1 month earlier. Jessica Clark jumped in and assembled answers to the many questions of council members. She took notes on the areas of the budget document that the council and residents would like to see changed, and she's already getting a team together to prepare for next year. I cannot thank my team enough. The star of the show is Finance Director Susan Chung. She ensures that the financial systems and processes of the city follow best practices and meet the highest fiscal and ethical standards. The rest of the team that worked on this budget, which includes all of the department heads and a number of other staff, went so far beyond the call of duty. They made sure that we met the budget deadlines and we could have the productive working relationships with our council. I want to thank the council for collaboration during this difficult time and virtually. Thank you to everybody. It's been a tough job. We're going to have a lot more to do, and we have a lot through the course of the next year. But I want to truly express my appreciation for the great work that has been done to date. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for those words. So now we will move on to the first item, which is our second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2021 tax rate. Would someone like to move the ordinance?
I'll move it.
Councilmember Siemens moves. Do I have a second?
Second.
Councilwoman Searcy, second. Do I have any comments or questions regarding the ordinance adopting the tax rate? All right, seeing none, will the clerk please call the vote?
Councilmember Kovar,
Anyone move? No.
Councilmember Dubala,
Yes.
Councilmember Costick,
Yes.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
No.
Councilmember Searcy,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, now we will vote to go into convene as the Storm Water Management Board. Will someone please move a motion to become the Storm Water Management Board?
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
That was Councilwoman Dubala and then Councilman Costick. Will the clerk please call the vote?
Councilmember Kovar,
Aye.
Councilmember Dubala,
Aye.
Councilmember Costick,
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy,
Aye.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, we are now the Stormwater Management Board. And we have before us the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2021 Stormwater Management Budget. Would someone like to move that?
Yes.
Councilwoman Dubala moved. Do I have a second?
Yes.
Second.
Councilwoman Searcy, second. Any questions or comments on the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2021 Stormwater Management Budget? Seeing none, will the clerk please call the vote?
Councilmember Kovar,
Aye.
Councilmember Dubala,
Yes.
Councilmember Costick,
Yes.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, next we have the second reading ordinance adopting the FY 2021 budget. Would someone like to move that?
Aye. Yes, I move it.
Yes, thank you. Councilmember Siemens moves. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Councilwoman Costick seconds. Any comments or questions on the budget ordinance? Councilmember Kovar.
Yeah, for some reason, I'm not seeing the regular hand raising icon, so I apologize for that. Just a couple of points I wanted to make. One of the questions that I've heard from people in the community is they wish that we could have set aside a larger amount of funds in the hold category, and the amount we set aside was 1.3 million. I thought we could have set aside more, but I do think that the setting aside and putting the funds on hold for potential use either for COVID-19 relief to plug the gaps in funding that we don't receive from other levels of government, or potentially to use it for the original purposes or keep it in the unassigned reserves, that sets an important precedent. And I think as we go forward, to me, in any case, and I am voting in favor of this budget resolution or the budget ordinance, I think having set that precedent, we're much more likely to be able to, if the need arises, to go beyond the 1.3 million that we set aside. In other words, because specifically we're going to be reviewing the budget at least every 3 months or sooner over the rest of the fiscal year, we'll be able to, I think, understand to the extent we may need to as we observe how the pandemic progresses and what the needs are within the community, the potential for additional funds that we might need. So while to me the amount that we set aside is not perfect, I think it allows us to make some important strides forward in having the kind of flexibility that we need in the budget. So I do plan to support it. And I just have one other question for the city manager, and this is something that was brought to my attention by some residents, and you may not be able to give a specific answer right now, but maybe you can comment generally about it and then get back to us later. This is something that I just heard about this afternoon, or was brought to my attention. So in the documents for this evening, it includes the general fund summary, and it lists the overall amounts for revenues and expenditures. And that varies some from the same document that was presented initially in early April 6th, I believe, when the budget was first presented. And so what are the factors that would explain? In some cases, the differences are somewhat small. In other cases, they're a little bit larger. But for the FY20 adopted numbers, for example, there is some variance between the two times in about a month and a half or so. And is that just the sort of general developments that occur routinely over the course of a budget year, or would there be other factors that would explain why some of those numbers could differ? And again, I understand you probably don't have those two sheets right in front of you now, but
I think the answer to your question is that when the proposed budget was prepared and presented on April 6th, there had been 2 budget amendments, and there was a subsequent budget amendment. And then, so it's more the correction that
was a fairly large third budget amendment that we did when we saw a number of
that's right.
projects and so on that might not finish by the end of the fiscal year.
That's right. And so one of the things that is confusing is that where it says adopted budget, it's the adopted budget as amended at that time. And so it does change it as there are various amendments.
I may send you a couple of specific questions.
Absolutely, that's fine.
About that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Like I said last week, I'm not going to support this budget, but I'd like to take a minute and quote Politico, what I would not consider a left-leaning magazine, that says the damage is spreading. This is regarding COVID-19. Minority business owners say they are struggling to stay afloat. Some 5% of Black and Latino small business owners anticipate closing in 6 months. According to a poll released Monday by Global Strategy Group for the nonprofit and civil rights advocacy groups Color of Change and Unidos US. The survey of more than 500 minority business owners, Black workers, and Latino workers found 51% of Black and Latino small business owners applied for less than $20,000 in federal relief each, but just 12% say they received the full amount of assistance. And it goes on to have a quote from the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, who said, "Coronavirus will have devastating effects on African Americans. Traditionally, when you put a Black face on policy issues," he said, "there is a loss of political will to ensure health and access in governance for everyone." And then finally, Vox.com did a piece May 6th that said the near certainty of a Black depression. Last time I checked that, the city of Tacoma Park was a majority ethnic city. And this just shows that 2 different publications that are not both left-leaning are saying that the effects of COVID-19 will have unprecedented negative impact on our community. I am disappointed that the amount of money that we are proposing to help the residents, the most vulnerable of this community, is less than $400 and some thousand, or $440,000, less than $500,000 that is actually allocated for this. I do recall when I first got on the council that $250,000 was allocated for climate change and making sure that we could bring on Gina Mathias as a city employee, and in a situation like COVID-19, that we are only doing twice as much as a sustainability manager. That to me is just unacceptable. So I will not be supporting this budget. I do not think it represents the morals and the future of Takoma Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Dabala.
Yes, thank you. I will, as I did last week, I will be voting for this budget. I think having a fair amount of money on hold is a good way, and quarterly reviews is a good way to approach it. The possibility of putting more money into the COVID fund exists as well. There's a whole lot of we don't know, and I think the quarterly review approach is a good one. That said, I have had a number of folks ask me if in the time since the original budget proposal was put in, if there is an opportunity to review right now the revenue projections for a couple of the other large sources of revenue for the city, the state income tax revenue and the intergovernmental revenues. And with so much press recently about the state projections being revised more optimistically, and with the county projections for their budget hitting the news recently, I think there's an opportunity here for a little bit of clarification on what we know, what we don't know, and when we might be able to take a look at a revised set of projections. As I started out saying, I think the notion of waiting 3 months, having the review, having the information then makes a great deal of sense to me. But I'm just checking in, since there's been a lot of news recently at the county and state level on revenue projections. City Manager, do you have any comments? Thank you.
I think the first comment is simply that I don't have any intention of waiting to share information as we learn any new information. The county council has voted on the county budget, and we will be getting over $5 million from the county council, from the Montgomery County budget. I do not see something that's significantly different about the revenue projections for FY21. I think that we will watch them closely, and we will watch particularly what might happen for FY22 and FY23. But if I find out anything new, I will share it right away. I'm not going to necessarily wait for some future date.
Yeah, maybe wait wasn't the right word, but I was trying to say I don't expect there to be a lot of firm information to work with right now to make revised projections, as important as they are.
That's correct. That's correct. We don't have something right away.
All right, thank you very much.
And before I turn it over to Councilman Costick, I just want to emphasize something, and this was something Councilman Costick mentioned the other day. Even during regular times, and the city manager pointed this out in answering Councilmember Kovar's question before, it is very usual for us to amend our budgets throughout the year and to revisit. The budget is, a plan moving forward, as a city manager has talked about before, and we've all talked about. But many times you have to adjust that plan, and there are ways that we can do that throughout. We've done it before, and we can continue to do it. And so I imagine, as Councilwoman Dabala just said, we've put into this ordinance, we've already discussed checking in more frequently regarding the city's financial situation, that we will be seeing a number of budget amendments throughout the year. Councilman Costick?
Thank you. Yeah, my question was similar to Councilmember Dabala's, and I also wanted to, sorry, I'm having an issue with my audio here. And I also wanted to ask about that, or note that that point, Mayor Stewart, that we will throughout the year have opportunities to make changes to the budget. And it seems to me, given some of the questions that we have this year that we may not have in a typical year, that will be more and more important than ever. And so I'm certainly anticipating that this budget is sort of a starting place in some ways, that there may be differences, there may be things we find out, there may be unexpected expenses, and there may be opportunities to provide additional COVID response assistance to businesses and residences if we find that we do not have other expenditures or there are other opportunities where people need assistance. So I think that's something that I'm looking at as I'm looking into this budget. And I just want to, again, reiterate my thanks to city staff, the council, and residents for everyone's attention and hard work on this budget.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Want to make sure I didn't miss any hands or anything? Okay, seeing none, I just want to point out before we move to the vote, and now I can't find it because some of the, I'm not sure sometimes if everybody always reads our ordinances, and I do want to specifically point out the language and what we are voting on tonight. I won't read the entire thing. I just wanted to pull out 3 or 4 of the whereas clauses to just highlight them. So in the budget ordinance, the 6th whereas clause says, the city and all levels of government are facing unprecedented challenges. Significant changes were required to adapt the recommended budget to reflect changes in city services due to the pandemic and the changed and uncertain economic conditions. I think as the city manager has said before, my colleagues have talked about over the last few weeks, there has been significant changes to this budget. We anticipate moving forward, we will continue to be looking at it. And I just want to reiterate and underscore my thanks to the city staff and all their hard work on this. It's been, you know, Councilmember Kovar, did you want to speak? I see your hand raised.
Only after you finished.
No,
what
go
you're
ahead.
talking
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to mention one other thing, and I apologize, I didn't mention it before. When you were reading through the upcoming agenda of future council meetings, and I guess I can confess that I sometimes don't pay as close attention when you do that as I should. I apologize for that. But you mentioned that on June 3rd, I know this is something that a lot of residents have asked about. We're having a closed session because it is connected to collective bargaining to discuss the personnel issues that relate to the budget. I have the right date, I think, right? It's June 3rd.
Mm-hmm.
Did I hear that correctly? So that's something that a number of people have been asking about, and specifically the question was, we shouldn't wait until our first quarterly review of the budget to delve into those personnel questions, and in fact, we aren't. We're going to be doing that in 2 weeks. So
Right. And
I just wanted to mention that. Sorry to interrupt.
No, and in fact, we also scheduled time to meet with our economic development manager and our housing department so that we're looking at the COVID-19 fund even before we get to the July 1st start. So I just wanted to read that whereas clause. The other one I wanted to read was the one that said, whereas given the unprecedented budgeting challenges being faced due to the pandemic, the council and city manager will need to work closely throughout the coming year to monitor revenues and expenditures to ensure the short and long-term fiscal health of the city. And that's exactly, thank you, Councilmember Kovar, we were just talking about. The next whereas clause says, whereas the city government is the first line of defense for those most impacted and vulnerable during the crisis. And I really want to underscore this point. We are right now, as we've talked about, our deputy city manager is putting together our costs so far, putting in things to FEMA, hoping that we will get reimbursed. Unfortunately, our county government still has not given us clear guidelines on what they are going to reimburse municipalities on regarding the CARES Act. I find that incredibly frustrating as we try and do our own budget here and look at providing assistance. And we do know the residents best. Our staff know our small businesses and our residents and the needs that they have. We are the first folks they turn to, and we are best situated to provide that need. And so I just want to underscore that and to say that we will continue to advocate at the county level and the state level and the federal level to get as much of what we're spending reimbursed. But that also adds to the uncertainty at this time and why we need to continue doing this work. The next whereas clause is that whereas a top priority of the city council is to have a budget that allows the city to respond to unknowns ahead and to provide for the well-being of its residents, businesses, and staff. And for that reason, we have established the COVID-19 fund with broad flexibility to provide assistance as needed. So I just wanted to highlight those because I think sometimes we vote on things and the ordinances can be long, and I'm not sure if people always read those. I just wanted to pull those out. And I want to say that, you know, I really thank the staff. I thank the residents and my colleagues for all the work that has gone into this budget. Our city services are going to be more vital than ever for our residents. We know, and I agree with Councilmember Smith, that while everyone in the community is affected by COVID-19, the impacts and how you're affected are not equal across everyone who lives in our community. And that is why we have to pay particular attention to the services that we are providing and to make sure that we have not only the revenue, but also the staff to provide the services. Because if we don't have the staff who are on the ground, who are making those connections with people, the money's going to sit there. It is our staff, the folks who work day in and day out, who know the residents, who can get them and connect them to the resources and to the services they need. That's so vital. So I just want to say that I'm really proud of the work that we have all done under these extraordinary circumstances. And I know if we come together in the spirit of mutual aid, which I think we actually do in this budget, we can make sure that we're all doing our part to make sure that every resident has a secure place to live in our city and has the access to the resources they need to address this uncertainty that's before us. So I thank you all for this work, and I know our work is not over. This is just one big piece of it, and we're going to continue working on this, but I really thank you all for all the hard work that went into this. And with that, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the vote.
Councilmember Kovar,
Aye.
Councilmember DeBala,
Aye.
Councilmember Costick,
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
No.
Councilmember Searcy,
Aye.
Mayor Stewart.
Aye. All right, thank you. So that is our FY 2021 budget. Just take a breath. Thank you all. All right, next, traffic calming. We have our first reading ordinance regarding traffic calming on the 7300 block, and then we'll do the 7600 block. I know additional information was provided to us regarding the traffic counts that our police department has done. I will ask first for someone to move the first reading ordinance for a traffic calming on the 7300 block of Wildwood Drive. Anyone
So
want to
moved.
move that? Councilman Searcy moved. Do I have a second? Councilman
Second.
DeBala, second. Any comments or questions on this? I just closed. Councilman Searcy. Oh, and then DeBala, sorry. And then Costa.
So thank you. I want to thank city staff for providing additional data on the traffic counts. And I appreciate the residents along Wildwood. It's a couple of speed bumps, but it means a lot. And the fact that I want to urge us to continue to work towards identifying more broader scale approaches to traffic calming, particularly for the areas that are negatively impacted as a result of the Purple Line. I think the thing that's going to be really critical is once Purple Line construction is complete, really taking a look at how it has made changes to traffic patterns along University Boulevard and through our city streets and coming up with a plan to really try to divert traffic in a way that makes the most sense, not just for drivers, but also for pedestrians and residents. So I want to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this resolution. Is it a resolution? I think it's a resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman DeBala and then Costick.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if we could get a very quick summary for the residents who didn't get the material about the traffic counts from someone.
I don't have them in front of me, and perhaps Ms. Braithwaite can answer that, but certainly what we saw presented from the police chief was that the numbers went up as the Purple Line construction continued. So
I think that was, yeah.
certainly, I don't know if somebody else wants to speak to it further, but it certainly was significantly different on the two different time periods.
Is Ms. Braithwaite, are you with us? Do you want to? I know from what the chief sent us, he said that he saw almost a doubling of traffic from the April study to the October study. And most of this can be attributed to the increased Purple Line overflow. There you are.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah,
No, that was good.
Unfortunately, I was not copied on any of that, so I don't have any of that background.
All right, but I think that's good. Doubling of traffic, bad.
Yeah, that was kind of,
Not a
that's
good
all I
thing.
needed. Thank you.
And I think given the testimony that we have heard from residents on this, we have both hard data from our traffic counts as well as firsthand experience.
Right. So what this is, these are ordinances, not resolutions, so that the traffic installation can occur.
Great. Councilman Costick.
Thank you. I do not believe I was copied on that message because I do not seem to have it. If someone could forward that to me, that would be useful. Yeah, I think that I strongly support this, and I think we need to move forward on this. I think this, as I said last week, outlines the need to improve our traffic calming process, our traffic calming request process and new sidewalk request process, which is something we've been working on and something we got recommendations on from the Complete Safe Streets Committee. I also think with regard to the data, this is something where we really need to ensure the data is being collected in a way that is comprehensive and collected in one place. And I don't know, I haven't seen this particular data. But in the past, we've gotten at the sort of where it's sort of individual reports for each street. As much as possible, I think it would be useful to put those counts together so that we can start to see some trends and we can start to see how things compare. And one of the things with regard to traffic calming and traffic planning in general is that it really is this cross-cutting thing where some of it is related to the police department, some of it is related to public works, some of it is related to planning and city planning and the planning department. And I think as much as possible we'll benefit as we bring those things together and we make sure that it's all data focused and data driven in terms of what we're doing, and that as much as possible, as we talked about last time, we are doing things in a specific order and a specific planned methodology so that we are considering how these changes impact other streets and how we are thinking about flow throughout the entire city. Thank you.
Great. All right. Seeing no other hands, will the clerk please call the vote?
Councilmember Kovar.
Aye.
Councilmember Kovar, are you voting?
Aye.
Councilmember DeBala.
Aye.
Councilmember Costick.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy.
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right, then we have the first reading ordinance regarding traffic calming on the 7600 block of Wildwood Drive. Would someone like to move that ordinance? Councilwoman Searcy moved. Yeah. Do I have a second?
Second.
Councilman DeBala, second. All right, I think this is, I'm not sure if we have any other comments on this. And I did just send the traffic counts to everyone. Apologies, that is my fault. I didn't realize they had just been sent to me. So my apologies. All right, will the clerk call the roll on this one?
Councilmember Kovar,
Aye.
Councilmember DeBala,
Aye.
Councilmember Costick,
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens,
Aye.
Councilmember Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Searcy,
Yes.
Mayor Stewart.
Yes. All right. The second reading of those will be brought back to us on the next meeting on June 3rd. All right, now we will move on to council comments. Any council comments? No council comments? All right, Councilman Costick.
Thank you. I will be brief. I feel like I've been on a Zoom meeting since 10 o'clock this morning, so I feel a little glazed over in the eyes. But I did want to share a couple of things. The TPB met today, and we had a couple of really interesting presentations that I just wanted to share some information from. One of the bits of information we got was regarding a study looking at transit agencies and the shortfall that they're experiencing due to lack of user rider revenue, rider fees. They're expecting a shortfall of $48 billion across the country, and that includes more than $23 billion after the assistance they're receiving from the CARES Act. They're seeing ridership down between 73 and 86%, and also anticipating further losses and gaps in the coming year due to reduced ridership overall and increased cleaning costs even as reopening happens. Additionally, they're anticipating a loss of construction jobs in the coming year due to not moving forward with some capital projects. So I just wanted to emphasize that there's a serious impact of this crisis on transit agencies. And I really think moving forward, this is going to impact our ability to access transit in the future. And as we're looking later today on our agenda, bus stops, that's something that's very, very important. And as much as possible, we need to be looking for opportunities to fill in the gaps and support transit whenever possible. We also had a presentation about some research that TPB staff have been doing regarding serious injuries and fatalities in the Washington region. There's a lot of really, really useful information and still some in development. The goal ultimately is to develop a database that would provide some analysis regarding different factors of where some of these most serious crashes are occurring. So a lot of this information could be extremely useful to us in working with SHA and in doing our own street planning in the future in terms of making our streets as safe as possible. I also want to thank the representatives who attended a WACO Neighborhood Association meeting from the utility companies. We had a meeting that ended just a couple minutes before this meeting. Really want to thank residents for coming out to that meeting. We heard from Pepco, Washington Gas, and the subcontractor CW and Sons at that meeting, and it was a good opportunity to start to hear from them and get some answers on some of the safety issues and the ongoing construction and frustrations that we've been experiencing in that neighborhood due to the construction. I think we still have a ways to go in terms of continuing to hear from them and improving some of those systems, but it was a good opportunity to get the ball rolling, and there'll be some follow-up on that I'll be providing as soon as I hear back with some of the follow-up items from the utilities. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now we have Councilman DeBala. Councilman DeBala, you're on mute.
let's start that again.
Yep.
Can everyone?
You good?
Okay. More regional news. The Chesapeake Bay Policy Committee also met, and in contrast, apparently, to the transit authorities, the water utilities in this region are doing marginally better under the COVID regime. So there was a presentation from the WSSC about how they are continuing to deliver water safely, how to test, how they're testing, how they're fixing pipes, a whole business, which was very interesting and very reassuring. They also talked about their revenue fall off, but it isn't anywhere near as dramatic. Nor are they seeing yet the number of water utility non-bill payment that would normally lead to shutdown that they were expecting. So that all was relatively good news. We also heard from the newly established Food and Agriculture Committee about the food security efforts in the region. I think we're familiar with what's going on right here in Tacoma Park, but it was interesting to hear how that is being replicated throughout Montgomery County and throughout the region. If anybody has any other questions on that, I'd be happy to answer them later. And next week, the climate group for the Regional Council of Governments is meeting. There'll be a special presentation on CPACE commercial loans for energy efficiency that I'll be attending, and the county energy coordinator will be speaking at a national organization meeting about the work that the county is continuing to do and regrouping on under COVID for climate action at the county level. And that should be really informative. I'm looking forward to that one. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. June 2nd, before we meet, is the primary election, and it's an all mail-in voting. And if someone hasn't gotten their ballot by now, I understand this is about the time when you'd want to be contacting the State Board of Elections to get a replacement so you get it in time. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you, Mayor. Just two things I wanted to mention. One, there's a fairly small construction project by WSSC at the intersection of Maple and Tulip, and I think today was going to be the last day of that. But I was alerted by a resident, and I didn't see this myself, to some lack of appropriate mask wearing and social distancing being conducted by the workers on the site. And so I encourage our staff, and I'll follow up with WSSC as well, to do what they can to let contractors know who are working in the city of the importance of abiding by those requirements, because in particular, when you're in a public area like that and people have to pass on the sidewalks, I think there's an understandable desire on the part of residents and others who are walking by to have the appropriate protections in place. And I've heard, in general, I've seen our staff are doing a great job of complying with those guidelines. I think occasionally there have been instances in which staff involved in sanitation and some of the other public facing positions may not have had the appropriate distance or masks, and so it might be worth just sending out a reminder to the staff of those who are interacting more directly with the public of the importance of doing that. One other thing I wanted to mention was I appreciate all the work that was done by my colleagues and staff, but also the city attorney. I think many residents who have been following this are aware that a revised order on the Maryland Public Information Act, the PIA as it's called, was issued yesterday, I believe it was. The city manager again signed it, and this order has two important distinctions from the earlier one. First of all, it clarifies in a more direct way that the potential extension of the 30-day deadline is only to apply in situations where the staff is unable, because of factors connected to the pandemic, to access or otherwise process documents and records that are requested, and that could involve situations when they're working remotely or when the records are only available in city facilities that are closed. And so I think that's an important distinction. The extension of the deadlines is not across the board, but only in those cases. And then the second piece, and this is important also, and I believe it was Councilmember Costick who suggested the inclusion of this, maybe others as well. We're going to review every 30 days, the council is, any instances of deadlines under the PIA that aren't able to be met because of the reasons I just gave previously. And so I think with those two changes, and in particular the second one, because it will give the council an ability to monitor this on an ongoing basis, I think the kind of transparency and accessibility and openness that we want and that we care about in the city will be appropriately protected for the during the pendency of the emergency order that the governor has put out. And so I just wanted to make sure that that's posted on the city website for those who want to look at the specific details. But I think the changes that are made in this newer order will go a long way toward addressing concerns that have been expressed. So I appreciate the city attorney, city manager, and other colleagues and staff who worked on that. Thank you.
Great. Just a couple of updates. I was been on calls with the county and on a call earlier this week with Delegate Charkoudian and Dr. Gales, the public health. I can't remember exactly what his title is, the public health person from Montgomery County. And again, just talking about the need for increased testing, the plans on contact tracing, and other things, particularly in those areas that have been hardest hit and have high rates of COVID-19. There are also plans, actually, Councilman Searcy, in particular, near your ward, of doing some coordinated work with Prince George's County and increasing testing in the Langley Park area. So we'll make sure that, I don't have any other details on that, but as details become available, make sure to keep you in the loop on that. In addition, I was on a call today for the Maryland Municipal League for municipalities around the state. And it was really interesting to hear colleagues in areas where they have begun opening up since last Friday. Unfortunately, the news is not great about preparing to open up. Many of them talked about things moving too fast, a lack of clarity coming from the state, not having clear parameters to the openings, specifically for bars and restaurants and things like that. And so I think MML will probably be reaching out to the governor to ask for greater guidance, particularly for municipalities, in terms of what are some guidelines that can be put in place across the board. But unfortunately, there seems to be a lot of confusion as things are starting to reopen. And so I'm glad Montgomery County is taking this a bit slower. I know our staff, as well as folks at the CDA, the Crossroads Development Authority, and OTBA are meeting with our businesses, talking to them about how we can, once Montgomery County does begin to open up a little bit more, ease into that. So, and I think that's it for me. I'm gonna turn over this to the city manager.
Thank you very much. In my city manager comments, which are posted, I also include information on the revised Public Information Act notice that is on the website. And I think Councilmember Kovar went over the major points fairly clearly. I want to note that we are planning for contactless library service. Our library staff has been working on this for several weeks and try to figure out the safe way for books to be borrowed. a plan is being developed, but we have a big problem, and that is that we need our books back. Many people checked out books right before the stay-at-home order went into practice, and they still have them. We would like to have them returned to our book bin so that we can they get quarantined a little bit, and then we're able to put them back on the shelves and be ready to be able to check them out for people and leave them to be picked up. So we're hoping to go live with a contactless book borrowing in early June. And if you've got some books, please turn them in and then start writing your wish list for the books that you'd like to check out. I noticed, I just want to remind people that we have a foreclosure prevention webinar tomorrow that we're sponsoring along with Civil Justice Incorporated. And one of the things I just want folks to realize is that there are a number of partners, community partners that are working with us to help residents who may be facing a variety of different challenges. This particular webinar is tomorrow from 6 to 7 on a Zoom system that you can, that I have a link to the how to register from my city manager comments. It's going to talk about mortgage forbearance and the CARES Act, foreclosure process and your rights, and free and low cost resources and services that are available to homeowners. We've been working both with renters and with homeowners as they face these various challenges. One thing the state has started, which I think is a wonderful program, is called the Caregiver Services Corps. If somebody is taking care of a senior on a daily basis and then cannot do so because of COVID-19, the state is now having volunteers and other resources be able to help that senior. And you can just call 211 from your phone to get to the office to ask for assistance, and they're able to answer in numerous languages. So that's something that we're trying to get the word out on. I have in my notes, and you can see online, a number of different activities that the Recreation Department's putting on, and some of them are really cool. So I want you to look at it, see the fun stuff. I know a few people, some of the council members participate in some of the classes, but they've got some new programs that I think people will find very interesting, and the teen programming looks pretty good. I'd like to also announce that we have an MML intern who's going to be working with the city. So at no cost to the city, we'll have for a couple months assistance in my office, a Miss Jordan Battle, who is a junior at the University of Maryland. She's in the School of Public Policy. And she is going to be working for the Deputy City Manager, focusing on implementing and documenting our race equity program, identifying COVID-19 federal reimbursement opportunities, doing budget monitoring, best practice research, and other projects of interest. And I think, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, speaking to Councilmember Smith's concerns, is how are we giving funds out on the COVID-19 and who benefits, and how does that fit in with our race equity focus? And so how we document that, I think, is going to be important, not only for us, but also as we make the case to Montgomery County that we have real needs in Tacoma Park that need to be reimbursed. And I'd finally like to note that Monday is Memorial Day and is a day off for city staff. I don't have any clue what a day off sounds like. And especially when I'm working, a number of people are working remotely, but we won't have people answering the phones and responding to emails on Monday. We won't have yard waste collection, but the police department is still there for emergency services. I do want to note, though, and this goes to the mayor's comments, Memorial Day weekend is traditionally a time of gathering. And this is not the time to ease up on mask wearing and all of the other social distance requirements. It's very scary. We are in a COVID hotspot in the country. The numbers aren't going down, and we need to double down wearing our masks. You need your mask anytime you're out around people. I appreciate Councilmember Kovar's acknowledgement that sometimes some of our staff are not wearing the masks. People, I yell at them when they're not. We have to do the right thing. And so I ask everybody to do the social distancing, wear the mask, wash your hands, keep it going so we can stay safe. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. All right, we'll move on now to our work session, which is going to be a presentation on bus amenities and accessibility. And I think am I turning it over to Ms. Grinsby and then to introduce, or who am I turning this over to?
Actually, Jamie Ernst, the city planner, is going to.
Jamie's here with us. Okay. Sorry, Jamie, I didn't see you.
Hi, I had my video off until now, but I will just briefly introduce the project and then KFH Group can take it away. So in May of last year, the city was awarded a technical assistance grant from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments to conduct a bus stop accessibility inventory, which specifically focused on inventorying all bus stops in the city and looking at ADA compliance, accessibility, amenities, and bike and pedestrian improvements, with the overall goal to help us facilitate region-wide multimodal transportation connectivity within the city. So our selected consultants, KFH Group, conducted a very extensive inventory of all city bus stops, focusing on the items that I mentioned, and have developed a final report and recommendations for how to best improve all the bus stops in the city, and especially focusing on bringing them into ADA compliance. So I will let them take it away with their presentation. I believe Will with KFH Group will be sharing his screen, and then they will be available, as will I, to answer any questions you might have.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Will Sutton, and I'm with KFH Group. Thank you for the introduction, Jamie. My colleague, Joey Seltniks, and I will kind of be double teaming the presentation, but I'll go ahead and share my screen with you guys just to make sure you can see everything. All right. Is everything coming through? Wonderful. Okay.
Yes.
So first off, really good evening, and thank you for your time today to really present and go over the results of the City of Tacoma Park's Bus Stop Improvement Plan. First off, I really want to thank Jamie and Roz for their continued guidance throughout the study. We've been working on this since last November, so we've actually seen a lot of improvements and changes in the city just since then. But I'll go ahead and get into the plan here. Right off the bat, there are 138 bus stops in the City of Tacoma Park. There are actually 3 transit providers that provide service within the city as well. You have WMATA's Metrobus, the Montgomery County Ride-On, and the University of Maryland Shuttle UM. However, it's the City of Tacoma Park that bears the responsibility for many of the passenger amenities and also the accessible pathways to the bus stops. Now, as Jamie mentioned, last year, the city reached out to the Metropolitan Council of Governments, or COG, and submitted an application for the Transportation Land Use Connections Grant Program. So this entire study is 100% paid by them. And I would also like to give a thank you to Matthew Gaskin, who is our COG liaison and who has helped us through the project. So before we get kind of into the results of the project and all of the details, I kind of wanted to talk about bus stops in general. Every transit rider starts their trip as a pedestrian. The foundation of a good bus stop is an accessible sidewalk, curb ramp, and street crossing to actually get to that bus stop. Whenever we do the bus stop evaluations, one of the first things I ask myself is, do you feel safe waiting for a bus here? And even beyond that, do you feel safe walking here? Both of those things should be true if you're going to have a good bus stop. In general, bus stops promote accessibility. It can be the difference between having to request a Metro Access ride 2 days ahead of time, or just walk out your door and hop on a high-frequency bus. It also results in equitable outcomes. may not be the case at this moment, but I looked up the census data's commuting patterns for the city of Tacoma Park. And in 2018, 29% of Tacoma Park's workers use public transit to commute to work. So this is a very large segment of the population that are using these public investments, these assets. Bus stops are also incredible marketing tools, not only for public transit in itself, as if a passerby sees a bus stop that is inviting and accessible, it's someplace that they would want to go. It gives them the opportunity to think about making that choice for transit. In addition, the city also has an advertising or a marketing contract with Insight Media, where they actually come and install shelters relatively, basically free in exchange for the actual advertising rights on the shelter itself. So there's a lot of pros here, but the other thing to think about is that bus stops are pieces of transportation infrastructure. They really kind of go over multiple jurisdictions. You have 3 different providers, multiple entities. They require a lot of communication. And they also require a fair amount of funding too. Improvements are not cheap, and bus stops do require maintenance and updating. So with that, I'm going to go to the next slide and introduce to you Joey Seltniks, who was one of our primary field surveyors during the bus stop assessment.
Yeah, so before we get into the actual results of that field survey, I just wanted to go over the bus stop accessibility guidelines that we used as the parameters for our field study. So these guidelines were instituted after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And those 2 guidelines are the ADA Accessibility Guidelines, or ADAG, and the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, or PROAG. And together, these guidelines state that a bus stop must have a firm and stable landing pad with a level slope that is at least 96 inches perpendicular from the curb and 60 inches parallel to the direction of the street, and that this landing pad connects to the street and the sidewalk. There are 2 graphics that you can see on the right that kind of outline what this would look like on a streetscape. These accessibility guidelines also outline guidelines for shelters, and it states that a shelter requires an interior space that is 30 inches wide and 48 inches deep, and that is so that somebody in a wheelchair can maneuver in and out of the shelter. So getting into the actual bus stop data collection and inventory, we, over the course of 5 days in December and January of 2019 and 2020, we evaluated 138 bus stops for ADA compliance. 54 of those bus stops were found to be ADA compliant, and 84 of those bus stops were found to be ADA non-compliant. The graph on the right shows the reasons why bus stops in Tacoma Park were deemed not compliant, the leading cause of which was a landing pad did not meet the 5-foot by 8-foot minimum size guideline. Another 6, and that was 57 of those stops. Another 16 stops either had a landing pad obstruction, which could be a trash can or a bench, or maybe a retaining wall or a fence from a nearby home. That was another 16 stops. Then a sign protrusion was found at 11 stops. This is where a sign was less than 80 inches tall and extended into the sidewalk. And then another 8 stops had an inaccessible pathway, which means that either the sidewalk was less than 4 feet wide or there was no sidewalk. Another 8 stops also did not have that 30-inch by 48-inch interior ground clearance that was discussed in the previous slide. Another important aspect of the field survey was noting what passenger amenities were at each bus stop. And this graph just shows what amenities we looked for and how many there were at each bus stop, at bus stops throughout the city. So 81% of bus stops in Tacoma Park had lighting within 30 feet. Lighting is a very useful amenity because it helps instill a sense of safety at the bus stop for riders, especially early in the morning and later at night. 54% of stops had trash cans and 42% of stops had recycling bins. Well, and every stop that had a recycling bin also had a trash can. 40% of stops had seating. 28% of stops had information cases, which are either the tubular Tacoma Park information cases that have the system map of all the routes that go through Tacoma Park, or the more square WMATA information cases that have a route map or a schedule. Another 26% of bus stops were connected to the bike network, either through bike amenities like Capital Rideshare or bike racks or bike repair stations, or they were connected to a road that had a shared lane or some other sort of bike network infrastructure. Another 18% of stops had a shelter, and 5% of stops had vendor publication boxes. And then I'm going to pass it back to Will to get into kind of what we did with those results.
Thank you, Joey. Yeah, so here we have the local bus stop guidelines that were developed as a part of the study. The key element of the guidelines is actually incorporating and prioritizing community requests while also setting the specific performance metrics for select passenger amenities, kind of like the shelter there you see with 30+ daily boardings. These guidelines are meant to be implemented citywide. ADA accessibility guidelines are required at all bus stops. Of course, that's the ADA coming in there. Lighting and seating at bus stops was also a priority of the cities that was identified during the study. Information cases and waste receptacles were really kind of left up to a site-by-site basis, given that can cause some NIMBYism within the community, especially with the garbage cans. And of course, shelters will be prioritized for stops with 30 or more boardings. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that every high ridership stop, every stop with 30+ boardings will get a shelter. During our assessment, we also noted that there are a lot of space and site constraints at many of the bus stops that really need to be weighed when considering doing expansions and other improvements. So on this slide, we've really kind of summed up our improvement plan in terms of funding. The estimated cost to bring every bus stop in the city into ADA compliance is $560,000. The total you see here incorporates the other city initiatives that were also identified in the guidelines. So if we look at the shelters, for example, they are really one of the most pricey categories, but underneath it, we only identified 8 shelters that need to be updated due to ADA compliance. 14 additional shelters were identified for stops that have 30 or more boardings. And looking at the cost of each shelter, it's about $15,000 a piece to purchase and install those. So that is something to keep in mind. However, with a contract with Insight, there is a possibility for some cost savings there. And generally across all of these costs, we talked about the multiple providers and the multi-jurisdictional elements here. These costs could be shared between providers and the county and other entities as well. So that is something to keep in mind as well. Really the primary issue with bus stops in the city, like Joey mentioned, are the landing pads. 72 bus stops need landing pad improvements. And while it may not be the highest dollar item, it really could kind of creep into needing to talk with property owners about acquisition around bus stops and kind of expanding that pad into existing elements and other things like that. And kind of going down the list, landing pads, curb ramps, and sidewalk improvements. Again, going back to the sidewalk as the foundation of the bus stop, really are the most expensive and important improvements that really can be made for accessibility to bus stops. Following that, we have lighting, digital displays for our sheltered stops, new signs for the sign protrusions, and I apologize, and detectable warnings on curb ramps is the very last category. Many of the bus stops in the city, when we look at the curb ramp, we want to make sure that they're in full ADA compliance, and they did not have the detectable warning or the truncated domes that you see on a lot of curb ramps as a warning. So for some curb ramps, that was the only thing holding them, or for some bus stops, that was the only element holding them back for compliance. And speaking of landing pads, as I mentioned, 72 bus stops require an expanded or improved landing pad. That's over half of the city's stops. As part of the analysis, we also used a maximum extent feasible analysis where we used bounding boxes and parcel data in GIS to estimate any potential right-of-way conflicts. And we located 35 stops out of those. So about half of the half that will likely need some more communication with property owners and perhaps some more involvement and communication. The constraints that we really can show off are more in the physical realm. As you can see on the slide, a lot of the bus stops kind of face issues with steep grades. You have retaining walls or even fences, or even overgrown vegetation that really overtakes the bus stop. So this is something to even consider in moving forward with those as well. And additionally, we located 8 bus stops that do require pathway improvements. We weren't able to conduct the analysis on those necessarily, so there may also be some issues that crop out of those improvements as well. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Joey to talk about the prioritization effort.
Yeah, so after we created the bus stop guidelines and got the costing estimates, it's important to start looking forward in how you can actually implement those changes and make those improvements at each bus stops, and kind of which bus stops should be the first to receive improvements. And so we created a prioritization score to help identify improvement areas. And that score was based on 4 different criteria. And those were land use, where a stop that was located near a medical facility or a shopping center would have a higher score than one that was located in a single family residential area. Ridership was another one of the criteria. Stops with higher ridership received a higher score. ADA compliance was another one of the criteria, where a stop that was ADA non-compliant had a higher priority than one that was compliant. The last of the 4 criteria was sidewalk connectivity, and a stop that had poor sidewalk connectivity or not as good sidewalk connectivity was prioritized over a stop that had good sidewalk connectivity. That can mean that there wasn't a curb ramp or the sidewalk was too narrow, something like that went into determining the sidewalk connectivity score. So throughout all of Takoma Park, the average bus stop priority score was 60. And in this, we also identified some high priority corridors where the stops along those corridors were a higher priority score than in other parts of Takoma Park. And those were University Boulevard, which had a 78.5 average priority score for all stops along there. New Hampshire Avenue had a 72 priority score average, and Flower Avenue had a 66.2 priority score average. And going along with those priority scores, we started to develop some improvement approaches that gave ideas in how Takoma Park can go forward to make these bus stop improvements in a fiscally responsible and effective manner. And we thought that implementation should focus on ridership, racial equity, climate impact, cost, and safety, and that decisions should be made balancing these different concerns. Another way to make improvements to bus stops is incorporating those improvements into other public works projects. Something that comes to mind is the New Hampshire Avenue Bikeway project. If efforts were made to incorporate bus stop improvements into that project, it could make a New Hampshire Avenue a safer road for multiple modes of transportation, be it walking, biking, riding public transit, or driving. And the final one is considering community-based approaches and creative elements. And this can entail a multitude of things, including reaching out to local artists, local businesses, to get ideas on how to make bus stop shelters or benches or different elements of the bus stop unique. And the picture on the right is the stone bus stop shelter that is outside of Washington Adventist Hospital. That is completely unique to the city. It's ADA compliant, and it adds a bit of character that isn't found throughout the city. So that's just an idea, and the kind of doing all of these things can help make bus stops an important part of the streetscape and become a part of the fabric of the city. And kind of as a final, as a positive note to end my piece of the presentation on, this is a bus stop at Flower Avenue and Kennebec Avenue that serves many residents of Takoma Park. And the picture on the left is what I took during my field survey in December, and there's no curb ramp. It's located on a driveway and the landing pad is not compliant. And to the right is a picture of that bus stop in April 2020, a couple weeks ago, where there's a compliant landing pad, a bright red curb ramp with the truncated domes or the bumps. And yeah, it was just a nice positive note to show that changes are being made currently in and around Tacoma Park to the bus stops and making bus stops safer for residents.
Thank you, Joey. And so really what's next after this plan? You know, for me, you know, I think about bus stops all the time. When I go into the city of Tacoma Park, one of the things that jumps out of me are the brightly colored porch rockers, the Adirondack chairs on New Hampshire Avenue, the turnable bus stop information tubes. For me, this really creates a sense of place. I know I'm in Tacoma Park when I start to see these elements. So I think kind of bringing them into the streetscape and kind of making them place-making elements really is beneficial. And it also works as a marketing opportunity to promote transit for people who might not think about it as well. But really to underscore Joey's point, consider bus stop improvements holistically. They are very expensive, so incorporating them in other projects can really, you can really realize a lot of cost savings. Some examples could be ADA sidewalk improvements, streetscape improvements, or even streetlight replacement and upgrades, tree pruning and vegetation management around stops. But one of the things that we like to say about our, you know, our bus stop plans and our inventories is that these are really a shot in time, or a snapshot in time, I should say. You know, like Joey showed with the bus stop improvements and sidewalk improvements on Flower Avenue, some of the information that we collected is already out of date. So actually maintaining the bus stop inventory and keeping that up to date, tracking improvements and reprioritizing improvements kind of on a rolling basis is really important to keep the program going. And even beyond that, it's really important to promote the progress that is being made through the program as well. Kind of showing this off to the community could generate interest and, you know, have somebody that, you know, oh, I just want to go see this bus stop because it's pretty, because it's an element, because I want to see what it adds to the city, and they might start thinking about using transit. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is, you know, bus stop amenities are pieces of transportation infrastructure. They do need to be maintained and replaced. While you can put out, you know, some of the most beautiful shelters and waste bins and this and that, you need to have a plan to maintain them, someone to pick up the trash, someone to kind of keep the program going. So this really is something that, you know, requires a lot of effort and a lot of interest. So with that, you know, I really want to thank you guys for your time and your participation. So if you have any questions, please let us know.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you for that presentation. It was terrific. We very much appreciate it. I will now open it up for my colleagues for questions. I see Councilman Kostick has a question.
Yes, thank you very much. This was a really great presentation, and I really appreciate all the information and the thought that went into this. I just have a couple of questions about a couple of questions and comments about your work and maybe how we could utilize it. You mentioned that you looked at the sidewalks, and I'm wondering to what extent and to what distance did you expand out that look? Did you consider the sidewalk on that block, or did it go beyond that to look at connectivity kind of in a broader sense?
So for ADA purposes, we look at the sidewalk to the nearest curb ramp. But when we're making the sidewalk connectivity assessment, it's a pretty qualitative assessment that shows stops on, like, the sidewalk on the opposite side of the street, if there's a intersection, a safe crossing area, things like that. But for the scope of the study, we were mainly looking at the bus stops. And the bus stop accessibility assessment goes from the bus stop to the nearest curb ramp for sidewalk accessibility.
Thank you. I'm really excited about this project in general, and I think this also provides an opportunity, because one of the things we've been talking about is looking at and assessing, as we're doing things like reevaluating our traffic calming request policy and our new sidewalk request policies, reevaluating the connectivity and where we might most need new sidewalks, where there might not be a sidewalk already. So I think it would be great if there's a way to utilize this information and kind of combine it with some of that broader look in terms of how we can connect not just to the nearest curb ramp, but also to schools, to shops, to areas with more housing, those sorts of things. I would love to kind of see if we can mesh these two efforts together and utilize those in a coordinated way. I'm also wondering, with regard to the recommendations that you made and the total funding, I think it was about 800,000. Were those my understanding was that those were targeted, that wasn't assuming every single bus stop was improved. And you listed 50,000 for sidewalk improvements there. Again, what was the thinking on that, and how did you break that down?
Cost estimates for bus stops are relatively challenging to come up with. We are very fortunate that one of our coworkers is actually embedded in the Montgomery County Public Transit Facilities Department. So we do have access to the cost estimates that they receive from their construction contractors and things like that. Concrete work is very complicated. It kind of goes to the depth of the base you're going to use and the extent of the project and things like that. So we have seen quotes from the Montgomery County where it's been a few thousand, it's been 20,000 to improve a sidewalk from the bus stop to the nearest curb ramp. So really what we do is we kind of try to take an average, try to take the middle ground, because really the high dollar amounts require more complex engineering, kind of like, moving earth, putting in retaining walls, things like that. So it's really difficult for us to go on a case-by-case basis with, I believe it was 72 bus stops with the landing pads and things like that. So we did kind of generalize the costs to a degree, just as kind of a planning estimate.
And can we expect that we'll have an actual map in hand, basically identifying the bus stops, the specific bus stops that you anticipate that you would prioritize? Or is it more sort of a general thing? I know you listed some of the streets there, New Hampshire Avenue, Flower, and University.
You're absolutely right. I do apologize. I know Jamie was asking me to mention the map. We have an online web GIS map that you can go and access, and you can look at all the stops that we've inventoried. You can actually see the pictures that we've taken, the actual amenities that are there, and also our prioritization and specific cost estimates for each stop.
Great.
This is Roz. Jamie's freezing.
Yeah, Jamie, you're free.
As I'm just going to jump in a minute and
On
say
the
we
city
have
website, access that.
There we go. We have the information up on the city website under the bus stop improvements page.
Thank you.
That's also what I was trying to say prior to my, but glad Roz got it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is excellent, and I'm looking forward also to hearing from city staff on what you think are next steps in terms of us being able to move forward on specific projects and which you are identifying with regard to some of the funding that we budgeted for in the coming fiscal year for the bus stop improvements. I just also wanted to note, first of all, I really appreciated the mention regarding the idea of making bus stops potentially a destination or something really beautiful to look at. If anyone has ever seen pictures of some of the Soviet bus stops, there's a beautiful book that actually has pictures of Soviet bus stops throughout the former Soviet Union, and some of them are amazing. I would highly recommend checking it out. And then the other note I wanted to make was one of the challenges that I see with achieving full accessibility of our bus stops and making them as great as they can be is often with regard to state highway and making sure that the projects that they are working on or need to be working on are completed so that our bus stops remain accessible and the sidewalks are accessible to them. So for example, there's a section in the junction that right next to the bus stop that has never been repaired after there was a section of the sidewalk taken out, and there's just gravel right there. And across from that picture that you showed of the stone bus stop next to the former hospital, right across from there is an extremely narrow, about 2 foot wide, crumbling sidewalk on the opposite side of that. And I think there are a lot of examples like that where we really need coordination with SHA, and we need help from them in making sure that the sidewalks leading up to those bus stops are as effective and accessible as possible.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue when doing bus stops. The coordination, and especially Tacoma Park's role, since you guys don't operate any transit service, and you guys are kind of a mediator to State Highway and then Ride-On and WMATA, and just developing those relationships with those agencies that impact transit and road design and sidewalks is definitely really important. And going forward, that's definitely something to maintain and develop those relationships with those agencies.
Great. Councilman Searcy.
Great. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was really great, and I appreciate I've had a chance to pick up to click on some of the maps and kind of play around with the data. So thank you very much for that. I do want to pick up where Councilmember Kostick left off in terms of coordination. It was mentioned in the recommendations that, you know, we should try to prioritize bus stops along University Boulevard, which is a state highway, but also the expectation is that there will probably be lots of bus stop relocations and movement of sidewalks and things as a result of Purple Line construction. So one question that I have for you all is, did you take any of those factors into consideration, or were you really just looking at the shelters and looking at the stops based on what they look like today?
The existing conditions that we saw, you know, back when we did the inventory over December and January, we did incorporate some, you know, potential considerations within the report for future projects and other capital improvement efforts. But on a case-by-case basis, we did not make that, you know, specific connection. So that you're absolutely right. You know, University, you know, Boulevard really showed up as the high priority corridor, and that makes a lot of sense because you do have, you know, very important trip destinations there, high ridership, you know, other things like that. So that is something to keep in mind. And I mean, that really is an element of the challenge, and really kind of keeping communication going amongst, you know, all these different entities and all these different, you know, improvement projects as well. So that's an excellent point.
And did you, you know, kind of thinking through the lens of connectivity? So one of the stops that was in your slide deck on University Boulevard is actually outside of the city of Tacoma Park. It's on the opposite side of the street. Don't worry, it's a mess over there. The lines are all over the place, but that it kind of brings the point of, you know, one bus stop may be on, you know, city of Tacoma Park property, and we're working to make improvements. But in order for residents to get to the city on the bus, they have to cross over into Prince George's County or cross over into, they're actually on the side of the street in the District of Columbia. So did you all take any of the connectivity into account, or was it just strictly within the city limits of the city? The maps look like they're strictly within the city, but some of the points that were highlighted were the other side of the street, if that makes sense.
It does. And that was during our kickoff meeting for the project. That was one of the first things we talked about, especially because you have the Tacoma Langley Transfer Center and also the metro station that are just right outside, you know, the city limits. But really, you know, in the conversation we had, there really isn't a whole lot that the city can do other than really advocate for those improvements. So we didn't specifically look at those and kind of consider them outside of the scope of the project, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, and while I was doing while I was doing some of the field survey, there were a couple stops that I went to that were slightly outside the city limits, and so that's where some of the pictures came from. And while I was doing my field survey, I would sometimes take pictures of bus stops that were interesting, just to kind of fill out the report and kind of the materials we give you, just for example, sometimes, because sometimes it's just good to show something.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually great. And what you all have done is, in my mind, is provided some talking points that we could do as a city in terms of how we're engaging with MTA on Purple Line construction and the bus stops and shelters and where they're located, but also as we try to engage with our colleagues in Prince George's County, Montgomery County, as well as the district, to try to make sure that there's synergy there, so residents will have complete connectivity. So thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And I would love for Jamie and Roz, if we could get like a summary of those key recommendations that are relevant to bus stops that are along the Purple Line route, that would be really helpful. As although we're working remotely right now, we just received a CAT Community Advisory Team meeting presentation yesterday. So it may be a good opportunity if these are some of the concerns that we want to make sure are addressed as they're making plans along the corridor to be able to communicate that. All right, thank you so much.
We will get you that information.
Perfect, thank you.
Councilman DeBala?
Yes, I was thinking about the same kinds of intergovernmental issues also. And I was thinking about if the top 3 priority areas are all on state highways, can we get a summary that we can then take shopping to SHA when we have our regular meetings with them and say, here's what's needed. What can you do with us to get this worked out? So that would be one thing that would be really useful, I think, is to split it up by with city versus state streets. And on the guidelines themselves, I thought I heard somebody say that the guidelines were required. And then I thought I heard somebody say that you created the guidelines. Whose guidelines are they? And are they required? And if so, by who? Just so I can understand that, because I'm new to this bus stop stuff. Thank you.
So we presented, so the guidelines that were discussed at the beginning about the 5-foot by 8-foot landing pad and those from the ADA accessibility guidelines, those are the enforceable standards adopted by the Department of Justice. So those are federally regulated.
Okay.
And we brought up bus stop guidelines later in the presentation, and those are the ones that Will and I, in conjunction with the planning staff, kind of developed internally. So those aren't like enforceable by the DOJ.
Great, that helped a lot, thanks. And then
this is Roz. I just wanted to jump in a minute. The prioritization comes from the council resolution passed in January that new bus shelters would be looked at based on ridership, racial equity, climate change, cost, and safety. Those
so
5
that was
factors.
going to be my actual next question, because I thought I heard that the prioritizing was based on land use. So if, maybe I misheard, but if most people are using this to go to work and they're going to the metro or they're going somewhere else outside of the city to work, but you're prioritizing people who are going to commercial centers, I didn't quite track that with the prioritization that we as a council talked about, which you referred to later, the racial equity, et cetera. So yes.
If I can just jump in and then I'll hand it over to Will. There are 2 different kinds of prioritization that we're talking about here. So council's resolution was to identify how the city would determine what they spent money on for bus shelters by those criteria. And that's what we had talked about in January. We asked KFH to specifically give us feedback when we realized how many bus stops were not ADA compliant and how many bus stops had very specific limitations and restrictions, to give us feedback on how we should think about how to spend money that would get us where we want to go most quickly. And so they developed a different kind of prioritization that I'll let them give you the details on. Will,
Absolutely right, Ross. Oh, sorry.
go for it.
So the prioritization scoring that we came up with, where the average bus stop got a score of 60, that was something that we actually developed internally. It was very important to us, the 5 different criteria that have been set forth by the city. But when it really came down to kind of quantifying those individual categories, it was really difficult to kind of pull a lot of that information, out. So we really lean towards, more high frequency service, kind of where you will get the biggest investment for your dollar spent. So we really did focus on, high activity commercial centers. So that really is a trend that is noticeable.
So high activity commercial centers are a trend that's noticeable because it's reflected in high ridership?
Exactly.
Okay.
And we did, and I also should state that we also included a Title VI analysis within our report as well.
Okay.
We didn't necessarily want to categorize individual bus stops, based on, racial equity or breakdown or things like that. So we kind of looked at census block groups, and we kind of ensured that improvements were equally balanced within the, above and below average percentage of low income, minority, and also limited English proficiency individuals.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, Councilmember Smith.
I appreciate you guys putting together this presentation. It's good that you guys use this data-centric approach. Can you tell me, when you look at the 3 top priority locations, what would be the cost if we made these changes to those 3 areas? Do you guys have that data?
But I would have to, you'd have to give me a few minutes to pull it out. So I'll probably have to circle back with you on that one. So yeah, we did not necessarily break it down by corridors. That was really something that we kind of summarized just to kind of highlight generally where the high priority areas that we identified were. We really didn't want to kind of specifically look at individual bus stops. So that was kind of our, aim at being kind of generally specific about where our priority areas had emerged.
Okay, now, when you, on your list of recommendations, it said something about real-time bus information. Is that the readers that you see like in the District of Columbia that tell you when the bus is coming? And so can you elaborate on that? How does that work? How do you plug into the internet, and who's in charge of maintaining that system?
Yes, absolutely. So those systems really are getting rolled out. Of course, they're all over the district, and we're starting to see a lot more in Montgomery County as well, especially on Veers Mill and also Rockville Pike. I've seen quite a few of those screens popping up, but generally they link to the actual. And there's different platforms, but NextBus is one of the more popular ones that actually provides real-time data that links up to those screens. And, I've actually seen screens that have, maybe 2 routes and the ETA for them, all the way over to, screens that actually show the entire route and exactly where the buses are. So there are a lot of different platforms and products out there for that type of, infrastructure. Working with Montgomery County, I actually don't remember off the top of my head who their contractor is. But they're currently in the process of whether they actually have scheduled times that they show on those boards instead of real-time information. So they're actually working out the kinks of that now to actually provide more of a real-time estimate of when the bus will arrive. So I know that there's been some relative kind of kinks with rolling that out. But really one of the main challenges is getting an electrical conduit to the bus stop. If there isn't one there already, for lighting or something like that, you could be looking at something, in a few thousand up to $10,000 to get that electrical line ran out there. The actual screens themselves, from what I've heard, are relatively inexpensive. They're about $1,000 or less. But of course, there is the contracting service where you pay kind of a monthly fee to keep that, the Wi-Fi and the data and the information running. So I'm not super clear on the specifics, but just as kind of a highlight, that those are some of the issues that I'm familiar with in regards to the screens.
So do the jurisdictions get to keep or have access to that data, or does the vendor keep it?
So typically it's the vendor that actually kind of keeps it and controls it. NextBus was the example I used. So they are placed GPS units on the buses to actually track where they are and where they're going. And they use that information themselves to feed the data for those screens. Now, it's not to say that Montgomery County can't, access and utilize that data, but it is kept by the private company, or it is stored by them, I guess you could say.
And so is it possible to put a Wi-Fi antenna on these modules? Because, in some of these communities, Wi-Fi is not as accessible in our more affluent areas. And I would think that a bus stop would be a great opportunity to push out, to use a force multiplier for, modest internet access.
Excellent point. And I'm not familiar with any Wi-Fi enabled bus stops in the Washington, but I have seen plenty of examples, out of New York City and out of some of the major cities in Europe as well, where that is a very popular item. Another thing we've even seen are actual charging stations in bus stops as well, where you can actually plug your phone in, get a charge, connect to the Wi-Fi, wait for the bus. So a lot of these elements are coming out, and as they become more popular, the costs are becoming much more practical too. So hopefully we will see more of those in the region over the next few years.
Yeah, I think that there's just so many things that you could add on to a bus stop that could really help residents, not just waiting for the bus, but kids doing homework now, if that Wi-Fi antenna is strong enough. Finally, it appears that you guys use Esri's product for the mapping. Did you guys consider using like their 3D product so we could get more of a three-dimensional understanding of where this is in relationship to the bus stops in our various wards?
To be completely honest with you, that really is not something that we considered doing, but it's definitely something we will look into its potential, opportunity. So I guess we could get back to you on seeing if that is a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, Esri just has so much power in their products. I think that would be really interesting. And another thing is opportunity mapping. I mean, bus stops is just one piece of it, but there are other things that are going on in the city that, would be very valuable information for the council to know. But thank you very much for you guys' work on this. Appreciate it.
Great. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. And first of all, thank you so much for this report. It's I think a very good analysis of the bus stop situation. And I appreciate kind of the thought that went into this. Tacoma Park prides itself on being a small town, even though we're in this big megalopolis. And so the general approach is, I think, good from a starting point. But I think that as a small town, we got to give some thought to the residents and the usage that we know that these bus stops get. And of course, I'm prejudiced because I represent an area that has a high volume of seniors and disabled residents who have special needs, including ADA compliance at the bus stops. And so I just, general comment is that I hope that as we move forward with this work, that we can inject some of that detailed knowledge to give, to influence the priorities of the work on the bus stops. Thank you.
Great. Councilmember Kovar.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if this was covered earlier. I lost the audio a couple of points, but it sounds like what from the presentation was being said is that our earlier discussion on bus stops was focused on those that had the highest ridership, which doesn't necessarily correlate with the focus of this, which is on the accessibility above other factors. And so I'm just wondering if the answer isn't known right now and we can get it later, that's okay. But is there a way of combining what had tentatively been focused on earlier, which was improving the busiest in terms of ridership stops that still didn't have shelters, and seeing how that merges with the ADA piece of it, because it seems like those are both priorities that should be emphasized. And I don't know if there's a way to do a cross section to bring them together. And again, if that question was already asked before, I apologize. And I don't know whether that's consultants or the city staff would have the answer to that.
So I'll jump in on that first. This is Roz. Yes, there's a way to integrate the two. We're really kind of talking about two different things. So when council passed those priorities, we were just looking at prioritizing which bus stops we should look at first for bus shelters. But what Will and Joey are presenting tonight, what KFH has done is a technical analysis looking at ADA compliance and broader amenities, so that there's an intersection of these two approaches. And what we have before you tonight is really the data-driven analysis of what we're looking at and how to become ADA compliant universally if possible, and then how to prioritize moving forward more broadly, not just bus shelters. But the discussion we had in January when we looked at the ridership maps was really looking at, given the costs involved and given the many demands we all have, how would we move forward in a comprehensive approach citywide? And what we have tonight really provides the foundation that we didn't have in January of the technical analysis of all those factors that need to be integrated into next steps.
Yeah, I think
if I might chime in, Susie Ludlow, City Manager, the part of ADA law is to prioritize the routes that are in most demand as well. So you do need to look through and not only identify, first of all of the ADA work that should be done, so you know what that scope is, but then you also work with folks with disabilities to identify which locations are more important and which ones need to go first. And so we have a very nice opportunity here to have both council priorities related to shelters and have all this data to start narrowing it down and putting those priorities into some order. We do need to consult with folks to help make that decision as well.
Right, and I guess the main reason I asked was just because I'm assuming it may be challenging for us to be able to afford everything that in theory it would be great to be able to do. And so I'm just wondering, sort of in terms of weighing that, if there's a site that is, say, clearly falls short of the accessibility requirements, and it's a very under ridered spot versus another one that maybe has a heavy ridership and is less challenging from an accessibility point of view. How do those two things get weighed against each other?
So the more important thing is that we have to ask the residents. It's called a ADA transition plan. And so it may be that there is a location that doesn't have high ridership, but has high priority for folks with disabilities. And so that would take a higher priority than we might be able to see just from numbers, because it's on a route that's adjacent to a medical facility or a school or some other destination. So we can do a pretty good guess at that, but there is a requirement for discussion with people that would use them.
Okay, thank you, appreciate it.
Jamie, the planner. I will also say the benefit of the work that Will and Joey have done is, now that we have identified those stops and then working with the community, we know now exactly what improvements need to be made to each individual stop to bring that stop into ADA compliance. And some of them might be just a matter of repositioning a sign or moving a trash can, which is obviously a very low financial commitment, but some of them might be expanding a landing pad, which obviously would require more planning and dedicated finances. But the benefit of this study is now we know individually what improvements are required for each stop.
Sure,
And
thank
this is Roz. I would just add one additional thing, and that is that part of the assessment we do is the convergence of many different factors. So for instance, the bus shelter at the intersection of New Hampshire Avenue and Holton was destroyed in a car accident. And it has not been replaced because the pad is not ADA compliant, and the company that ordinarily does our bus shelters refuses to replace a non-compliant spot. And so there's a high ridership. We know it's got ADA issues. That seems like an easy one to say that let's take a look at that early in the process and see what it would take. We've been already in conversations with Daryl and Public Works on how to make, because it's a landing pad question, which is the more expensive problems of the ADA non-compliance. But that's a convergence of several different factors that might push that one up higher on the list.
Thank you.
Okay. I had a question on, and if this was is outside the scope of what you did was great and gives us a lot of information. And I think I think my colleagues have answered a lot of the questions. But one of the things I was also curious about is, as you looked at these different different criteria that you looked at, like the shelter, seating, ADA compliance, and the pad and everything, are there certain things that are more likely to help increase ridership versus making something more accessible? Like I see those things as related, but also have separate components. And I was just curious if you had some thoughts on that.
You know, it's actually funny that you mentioned that. Go ahead, Joey. Yeah, you
go ahead, Will.
a lot of
You got it,
research.
Will.
Okay. Well, no, sorry. So that's actually kind of funny because that was one of the study questions that really came up very early on. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific improvement that is guaranteed to improve ridership at a stop? And the question to that is not very clear cut at all. There are a number of studies. I think we did a literature review of about 10 of them, I want to say, that's actually included in the report.
More or less.
Yes, and we did find somewhat strong correlations between in areas that had implemented full citywide, jurisdictional-wide bus stop improvements. We saw increased ridership. Shelters, we saw minor increases, not exactly as much as you would think. One of the more interesting ones, and this kind of goes into a conversation you were having earlier, is tree canopy. So actually having a tree canopy around the stop, which provides shade, was actually one of the things that showed some positive correlation. But even when I'm saying some, it's very low. It's surprisingly low, even to the point where a lot of the researchers said that there really is not a statistically significant correlation between improvements and stops. Although there were some studies that did show very obvious negative correlations in areas where development went away, activity disappeared, things like that, or if you take away amenities and things like that. So kind of a long story short, it's very complicated. And there's really
yeah.
Great.
And a lot of
that's
it goes
really
in. Oops, sorry.
No, go ahead, Joey. Go ahead.
And a lot of it goes into what Will was talking about earlier with a holistic approach to bus stop improvements, where improving a sidewalk maybe 2 blocks away from the bus stop has the potential to increase ridership because it may be easier to walk to the bus stop. It may be safer for others. So with the actual improving ridership, it's hard to say just installing a shelter leads to high ridership, because also high ridership leads to installing a shelter. And, so there's all these, it's a constantly moving sort of relationship and always expanding. So it's really good to think about it big picture with transit and with the rest of the streetscape and sort of other planning projects. So, yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, this doing work in this area did survive our budget, which I'm thankful for. So we're glad you're here, and that we're able to move forward in some of this work in this next fiscal year. I guess my next question is for the staff. What are the next steps now of this?
I think the next step really is to give us a chance to continue to digest the data and probably come back to council. We have our eye on several possible next steps for the bus shelters. We've been working on that now for a longer period of time. I think for the ADA compliance, the next step is for the planning staff and the public works director to sit down and kind of map out how can we integrate with sidewalk work and some of those things and make sure that we're hitting the shelter landing pad improvements that need to happen.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, the digesting part is important. Having coming through the entire budget process, we also need to see how it integrates with some of our other projects so that we can capitalize when we are doing something. You know, and it even involves arts or other kinds of things as we make these improvements. As the presenters noted, the work on Flower Avenue is a great improvement. So we have a number of bus stops that are getting really essential improvements on a street, and that's exciting. So we just have to, as we get these different projects, really integrate bus improvements in each one.
Great, and I do like the ideas Councilman Costick talked about, and the city manager just did on incorporating the arts in this. And I remember back in January when we started talking about this, and it's in a community not far from here that did a whole arts project that was just highlighted, I think, in the Washington Post. So I think this is a really neat opportunity, and particularly as we're in this next year, we know with so much uncertainty living with COVID-19 and other things that I think doing this work could be really beneficial on a lot of fronts. And so thank you, Will and Joey, for the presentation tonight. Thank you, Jamie and Roz. And I think that brings us to the end of our meeting this evening. Thank you, everyone. As a reminder, we do not have a council meeting next week, so our next meeting is June 3rd. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening. We're adjourned.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.